Hi, this is Kevin Wilson of the Urban Homesteading School in Powell River on the west coast of Canada. Now, of course, you don't have to buy containers to put your seedlings in to start your seeds. You can use a whole bunch of different recycled containers. Now, some of the obvious ones are any kind of size of cottage cheese, sour cream, yogurt type pots. That's a pretty big one and would be a good one to pot up tomato plants into so that when they go outside they've got a really good big root system. You always want to make holes in the bottom. You can use a knife. This is like an X-Acto knife, but you can use a box cutter or anything like that. And the other way to do it is just to take a drill and drill holes. And that's really handy if you've got a stack of multiple pots the same size, because you can just drill straight through and do all of them at once. And you put multiple holes. It's a really good idea to put some just above the edge too, because these ones that are flat on the bottom can sit flat against the tray that you're putting them in, or the surface that you're sitting them on, and actually block the hole. So having some up around the edge is a good idea too. So those make good little pots. Toilet roll tubes also make surprisingly good pots. If you've got something that has a long taproot, like a corn plant or a bean plant, just using them straight like this is really good. You can just stand them in whatever tray you've got, put the soil in there, and put your seed in the top, and they'll grow a nice long root system. And by the time you come to want to take them out of the tray and plant them, hopefully, the roots have completely filled the soil area inside there and will hold it all together when you take it out. Now, when you plant things like this, either these or the newspaper pots I'll show you, you always need to make sure that you don't have any of the paper or card sticking out above the soil once it's planted. Because if it does, if it is sticking out, it will act like a wick and it'll suck the water out of the soil into the air and end up drying out the soil around the roots of the plant, which of course is not what you want. So you tear it back down to around about the soil level or just below the soil level, and then when you plant it, bring the soil over the top so that it's all continuous and you don't have this little cardboard rim sticking up. Now, you don't always need something this tall, so you can actually use a knife or something like that, a pair of scissors, and make 4 cuts down about 3/4 of an inch or an inch. It's not critical. Whoops, I went rather too far. And then fold them in. So what you have there, especially if you do them like a cardboard box where you flip them over each other, is a much more solid bottom, so that instead of having to keep it stood on a flat surface all the time, you can lift it up and it actually has a bottom to it. So that's just as good. Newspaper pots I mentioned. The way you do that is a piece of newspaper, several layers, this is 2 layers, and take a straight-sided jar or vase or glass or pot of some kind, maybe a sauce bottle, that gives you a nice smaller size one, and you roll it up. So roll it around like that. There we go. I usually find that it needs a wee bit of tape to hold it, so you can use a bit of paper tape, masking tape, and then fold in the bottom. Now this has turned out, this is a little bit too wide, so I'm going to trim the bottom like that. There we go. Fold the bottom in, bing, 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 and again a little bit of tape helps. Now you can buy a little doohickey called a pot maker, which is a wooden mold which helps you to make these, and it kind of folds in the bottom and crimps it, which is handy. It means you don't have to use the tape, but on the other hand you've got to buy it and then it only makes one size, whereas with this you can, if you can ever get the jar out of the inside of it. Come on. There we go. I maybe wrapped it up a bit too tight. But anyway, there's your nice size pot. And of course, you're going to want a good solid tray to put those in, because the bottom will get pretty squishy. Now, with all these paper ones, one thing that does happen sometimes if you have plants in them for a long time is they get mold on the outside, which looks ugly. It doesn't harm the plants. If you've got somebody allergic to mold in the household, that might be a problem. It all depends, because people are allergic to different kinds of molds, of course. You might have to try it out and see what happens. But yeah, it won't hurt the plants. Let's make a smaller one here. Now for this one, I'm only going to need half a sheet like that. Fold it in half so it's nice and thick. And take this smaller jar, and I probably don't need to do that entire length of a piece of paper either. I can get 2 pots out of one length. And then I'm just going to fold the bottom in like that. And put a bit of tape on it. This one looks like it'd be a bit easier to get out. Yes, but still, don't wrap it too tight. Otherwise there's so much vacuum in the bottom you can't get the mold out. So that makes a nice smaller one. It's about 1.5 inches in diameter. This one's looks like about 2.5 inches. So you can make them whatever size you want. You know, if you need a particular size for a certain project, make them the right size. I know people who sit there watching TV during the winter making these things and filling a big Rubbermaid bin full of them, and so in the spring they're all ready with dozens and dozens or even hundreds of paper pots. Now you'll notice that this newspaper has coloured inks on it. There is a good deal of confusion and not really good information about whether it's okay to use newspaper with coloured inks. It used to be that we were told not to use the coloured inks because the black ones were non-toxic and these were toxic, and then you can use anything because they're all soy-based inks. I think you need to go and do your own checking online if you are worried about that. I'm not worried about it. There's such a tiny amount of whatever is in these inks going into the soil. It's not that big of a deal for me. But if it's something you're worried about, then go do some research and reading and find out something that is going to be comfortable for you. Maybe you're not going to be using the coloured papers. It's actually quite hard to get black and white only newspaper nowadays, unless you actually buy a newspaper. You know, if you buy one of the older style newspapers, then yeah, you get lots of black and white newspaper. But if, like us, you don't buy a newspaper and your only newspaper which has lots of colour in it, well then you've got coloured newspaper. And the last thing I've got here for these recycled ones is an egg carton. People often recommend using egg cartons. They're really small. There's way less amount of soil in here than there is in even one of the smaller cell pack 6 in a go containers. And if you cut them into individuals, it's even less, because you can see how little depth there is there. If you cut through that, soil's going to fall out sideways and you're not even going to have the 1 or 1.5 inches of depth that it looks like. So if you can, keep them together and fill them right to the very top. And then of course don't leave the plants in them for very long. They really don't have enough soil depth or soil volume to hold the plants for long. You can grow some nice little lettuce seedlings and so on in there, and then either put them into a new pot or put them outside, because lettuce is pretty good in the cold. So let's fill a few of these and put them in a tray. I'm using this quite fine soil here. One thing when you're filling with soil, with these particularly, you really want to get them well filled up, and then just tap them on the surface a little bit just to firm the soil a little bit. You don't want to get all the air out of the soil. That's one of the things it's doing there, is providing air to the roots. So don't squish it down. When I do this kind of thing with kids, that's what they want to do. Once they put their seed in there, it's like, mash this soil down. No, 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 you don't want to do that. So then you can make a little dibble if you want to for your seed. If you're doing a lot of these, it makes sense to make like something, a piece of cardboard with some pieces of wood sticking out, so you can make a dibble in all 6 at once if you're doing lots like this, or if you're using things like the cell packs where you've got a lot of the same size and same layout. You can speed things up by doing that. And then your seed goes in the top, just cover it up a little tiny bit and just firm it down gently. What you want is for the seed to be nicely in contact with the soil so that the water can pass from the soil into the seed. The seed needs to take up water in order to grow. Now, this soil here, you can see it's not terribly wet. It's a little bit damp, but it's not particularly wet. So we're really going to have to water this well, and with the coir like this, it takes up water really nicely, even if it's quite dry. So I'm going to put this in the tray here, and I'll put some water in it in a moment and water it from the bottom. If you've got peat, you absolutely must wet it first, because it doesn't take up water easily when it's dry. If you fill a container with dry peat and try and water it from the bottom, it can take days for the water to actually get up to the top, if it ever does. You really want to damp it down properly the day before. Get the stuff out of its bag, into a bin of some kind, water it well, squish it up, and then leave it at least 24 hours. More if you can. If you've got the time to do it sooner ahead of time, then do, because it's really hard to wet dry peat. And never, ever, ever let it dry out, because you'll have terrible trouble wetting it again. Okay, so we've got that one filled. You've got to be pretty gentle with these paper ones. So again, no squishing them about. Just tap to firm the soil a little bit, make a little dibble if you need to, and put your seeds in the top. How deep should you plant the seeds? That's one of these things where there's a rule of thumb which says plant the seed 3 times as deep as it is wide. Now, some seeds are so small it's really impossible to tell, and some seeds are so big, then, you know, if you've got a squash seed that is from a big squash and it's 3/8 of an inch across, you probably don't want to be planting it 9/8 an inch deep. So that's something to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt, especially if I'm planting several seeds. So I'm going to end up with something like this. So I want several seedlings in each cell. I'll just sprinkle them on the top and then just sort of dibble the soil about with a finger or the end of a pencil, firm it down a little bit, and they'll be good enough for depth. When you're growing them inside like this, you are controlling the conditions much better than outside. So they'll have good conditions, and nearly all of those seeds will germinate if you've got good seed. So that's filling them up. We've got them in a nice solid tray, and we need to water them from the bottom. So let's get some water here, and just want about 1/4 of an inch in the bottom of your tray. If you put too much in, your containers will start to float away, depending on how dry the soil is. If it's dry, then they might start to float, which is not really what you want. So put 1/4 of an inch in the bottom, leave it sit for a while, come back to it later and see, has it all sucked up into the containers? Can you see damp soil on the top? If you can see damp soil on the top, you're good. You don't need any more. If you can't, if it's still dry on the top, put more in the tray and let that soak up too. And eventually, once it's water on the top, not standing water, but damp soil, then you can drain away whatever water's left sitting in the bottom of the tray and put some kind of a clear cover over the top. Now this actually was part of this food container, and it goes around this way. So it'll just sit on like that. Now, here's a little problem. This is really too tall for this container and this lid. So you're going to want to have something a bit bigger. Something like this spinach one would work, but it's going to have to cover the complete container, so you'll need to find something better to sit them in. If you just had, though, your egg cartons, then that's going to work just fine. You could just put that on like that. It doesn't have to be super tall, because once your seeds have sprouted and you've got little green plants coming up, you want to take this off anyway. They need to have air and to be not completely damp all the time. What this is doing while it's on is it means you don't have to water again. The soil is moist, it's going to stay moist because you've got the lid on. There's a nice little greenhouse moist environment in there. The soil stays moist and it's good for sprouting. But take it off as soon as your seeds actually show green leaves.